interview with producer-engineer Randy Burns. Inside the album, Megadeth, Peace Sells, But Who's Buying? More info at fullandbloom.com. I know that you were already working with Combat Records, but what are some of the things that lead up to you recording Megadeth's Peace Sells, But Who's Buying?
I did that for Steve Sinclair. He signed Megadeth at Combat, and I did a lot of records for Steve. Steve and I originally met when he worked on this punk compilation in Orange County and Long Beach, and he got all these punk bands, these LA punk bands, a lot of Orange County bands. There were like 10 of them, and he and Ron Gowdy and, there was one other guy, Jim Beamus, put together this little record company, and they came to me. I had a little 8-track studio in Orange County at the time, and they came to me and wanted me to make this punk compilation with them, which I did, and that was Hell Comes to Your House. And that had a bunch of kind of important punk bands on it. Social Distortion, it was their first recording, I think, and there was 45 Grave and a few other bands that went on to, they call it death rock now, and then it was just sort of, it was punk. Anyway, I started up a relationship with Steve and Ron Gowdy, and then Steve Sinclair ended up at Combat Records, and he just continued that relationship and gave me a lot of work. Leading up to Megadeth was just a whole bunch of albums that I did for Steve Sinclair at Combat Records. I was one of his go-to guys, and I actually was taking a break from Hollywood. This was like 84, I think. I was going to the junior college and studying computer science and calculus. I was real interested in computers. PCs were a new thing then. I think the Mac came out in 1980. So we were like the early Windows but we were starting to see computers in the control room in the studio too. So it was a new thing. Anyway, Steve called me up and said, I've got this band. You're the only guy that I want to do it. I want you to go listen to it. And I said, sure. So I went down and listened to them at a rehearsal room in LA. They played their set, and I knew right then that it was a hit record. I quit school and started working on the record the next day.
What was that first impression like? I mean, what was it that made you know that was a hit? Was there a certain song or just the whole vibe or the way they played?
They were just so good. They were just off the road. They were so tight and so good, and the songs were so together. I was just totally blown away. And I had this feeling, which I never had again. I only had it once. I just knew this one was going to be a big record. So I went for it, and it turned out that way.
I know you had already done Possessed by then. Were there a few other thrash metal bands that you had done besides the punk?
I don't remember the exact sequence, but yeah, there were a few in there before Megadeth. Now Megadeth, they were sold on me not because of the thrash stuff that I'd done, but because I had done this first Suicidal Tendencies record, the one with Institutionalized. All I wanted was a Pepsi. That's what they were impressed with. They said, okay, you did that, you're okay. You can work with us.
And so at this point, there's no deal with Capitol. That comes following the recording, correct?
Correct. They were signed to Combat. It was their second record for Combat. They got a little bit bigger budget for this one, but it was still pretty small. I think we had $20K to do the record. And then we went a little bit over and got a few thousand more dollars from them. But what happened was there were two producers listed, myself and Dave Mustaine. And at the end, the day we finished it, Dave went back to the studio, and because he was a producer, they released the tapes to him. He took the tapes. Then he went and started negotiating a new contract with possession of the tapes as leverage. So it ended up, he made a deal with Capitol, and Combat got something. I don't know what, but they certainly got reimbursed for their studio time and some other stuff. But Dave taped and went and started negotiating. While they were in the studio and we were recording the album, there was a real buzz around town, and record companies were calling and stopping by every day, different labels, checking it out. They had a real buzz. Other bands would stop by too. Metallica stopped by. Everybody knew that this thing was happening, and it was going to be a big record.
Where did you guys record that album?
We did the tracking, the original tracking, and the mixing at Music Writer Studios, and then we did overdubs at Mad Dog Studios in Venice Beach. Now, Capitol remixed it. They immediately mixed it again when they got their hands on it. And and I don't know where they did that. But the album was, the initial basic tracks were recorded at Music Grinder, and the overdubs were at Mad Dog Studio in Venice Beach. The reason I got so much work was I was able to produce high-quality records for not a lot of money. So I could give them a pre-beach and thrash record for $10,000 or $12,000. That was real competitive, and what I would do is I would go to Music Grinder, which was a big studio, and tracks there. It was Neve Studer, very nice. And I would also rent amps and drums. We had a drum tech and drum rental guy named called the Drum Doctor, and he did everybody. He had many major label clients, and he did all kinds of artists. He'd do Michael Jackson sessions. He did every session. And he would come in and set up his drums exactly like the drum kit for the drummer. Only his drums were perfect, hand-beated and tuned perfect and sounded great. So we didn't spend so much time trying to get a drum sound. We got a great drum sound right away. And then we used to rent Marshalls from Mike Soldano, who later had his own company where he sold those. So anyway, we would rent some amps from Mike Soldano, who at the time ran a little shop where he hot rodded amps for people. So, you know, if you were Eddie Van Halen, you wanted your Marshall revved up, you would send it over to Mike Soldano. But he had a bunch of them he would rent to us when we were in the studio. So anyway, I would do the stuff in the big studio for the tracking. Then I would go to a small studio like Mad Dog and do overdubs, and then we would come back and mix a grinder. That was sort of my recipe for making a high-quality record for not a lot of money.
He had modified a Marshall?
Originally, he had modified Marshalls, but then later on, he had his own design, which became very popular.
But during the recording of Peace Sells, does he have his own line?
Those, I think, were just hot-rodded Marshalls. And we didn't use those exclusively, but they had, the band had several Marshalls. I think they also had a twin, and Chris Poland did a lot of interesting things. He played through a Rockman into the twin for a couple of tunes.
Wow.
And he played on the Rockman straight into the board, I think, on one tune. So he did a lot of interesting things.
They were using a lot of BC Rich guitars at that time, right?
You know, I don't recall. Chris had a Yamaha guitar. Chris played my Les Paul. I have an old Les Paul, 70 or early 70s. The serial numbers are screwed up, so they're not exactly sure, but 72 to 74, something like that. Yeah, I actually got it from Joe Perry. Vintage Les Paul Black Beauty. It just sounds great. He played a couple of things on it. I think he did Ain't Superstitious. I think he used it on that. So we went for a more traditional, older sound.
He was selling gear, I know, at one point, because I know Slash got one of his guitars. Is that just during that period? Is that how you got the guitar?
No, I got it in the early 70s when I lived in St. Louis. There was a guitar luthier there that was pretty famous. He did a lot of people's guitars. Locally, we had Ted Nugent. He did all of Ted Nugent's guitars. Anyway, my Les Paul Deluxe I took down there and said, I want you to put the big humbuckings in it. He said, okay. He called me back a little while later and said, hey, I got a guy here that would really like to have your guitar. And he's got a Black Beauty with the humbuckers on it that you want. You want to swap? And I said, sure, let me come down and play it. So I came down and played it, and I said, yeah, this is great, let's do it. And he told me then, he said, yeah, that's Joe Perry's guitar. I got it in a swap that was arranged by my luthier in St. Louis.
Wow.
Anyway, he had, I think Dave Ellison only played one bass. He had one bass, and it may have been a BC Rich, I'm not sure. And Dave, I think, stuck with one guitar. But Chris had a number of guitars he played. He would play different guitars on different things, just whatever kind of mood he was in. Chris is also a guitar tech, like a really good one. And he took a look at my Les Paul and said, this thing needs a fret job. Let me do it for you real quick. And I said, oh, okay. And he went in the other room and set up something on a little table in there, and he got out, whipped out his tools and whipped out a big file and just started hammering on the frets, and took him about an hour. And he did a fret job on it, and then restrang it, brought it back in, said, okay, let's do it now. That was something I remember real distinctly, is Chris being really, really talented with the guitar tech stuff.
That's incredible. Was he going out on the road prior to Megadeth, like touring with bands as a tech?
No, I think he worked in a factory, though. I think he worked in a Jackson factory as a guitar finisher, so the guitars would come through, and before they would go out, he would fine-tune them before they went out the door. I think think he did that for a while. So he had some professional experience.
Do you recall what kind of Neve board they had at Grinder?
No, those Neve boards were kind of custom. It was very much the same vintage as the one that was in, if you saw the movie Sound City,
sure.
With David Grohl.
Sure.
Yeah, it was very similar to that one. It was in that vintage. It sounded great, and the Neve Studer combination was really fantastic. It was a great studio to track in and a good studio to mix in. I got a job there as an assistant engineer, and I was one of the staff engineers there for a year or so. And then when I started doing my own stuff and started firsting and producing, I came back there because it was a great studio, and I knew it really well.
And so that budget is, I mean, considering the thrash bands at that time, I just, told you I talked to Bill, and I mean, they did that first Slayer record for $1,500, and then they stiffed them, on half of that, he said. And I think even Kill 'Em All was done for like 10. I mean, that was a relatively high budget for something off of Combat, correct?
Peace Sells was, right. Many of the other records I did for them were more in the 10 grand range. That was typically what we did it for.
How long did that album take to record?
I don't know. Maybe it was about a month altogether, I think. I think we booked 4 days to track at Grinder, and then 4 days to mix at Grinder, and then we were doing nights at Mad Dog Studios. And Mad Dog was owned by a guy named Dusty Wakeman. It was kind of interesting. We were doing nights, and Dwight Yoakam was doing days. And then we would cross over around 6 in the evening. Our guys would come in, and their guys would be leaving, and it was an interesting scene. Everybody got along really good, and we met them, and it was nice. They were recording guitars and Cadillacs there, and which I don't know how many thrash people know, but it was a big country album.
Is there any kind of memory that stands out when you reflect on those sessions?
Well, my favorite Megadeth story is the day we were started, I was really excited, and we were working with Casey McMacken. He was another engineer at Music Grinder that I hired to do Peace Sells with me. He did a bunch of albums with me. So we came in, and we had the drum doctor in, and we had the drums set up, the amp set up, and got everything, got sounds, and got ready to go. And I came in and sat down and the console, and Casey was sitting at the console, and we're looking around, and there were no band members there. So this went on for a few minutes, and then finally I said, Casey, what's going on? Where are these guys? What happened to them? And he sat there for a long minute, and then he turned around, and he said, they're all in some bathroom shooting up.
Holy shit.
And I was like, I had no idea. I mean, it was like really absolutely clueless. So shortly thereafter, they popped out and started playing, and they were just incredible. It was a great session. They worked really hard. They played great, and it was really it was pretty exciting. So I didn't think about much after that, but it was my first introduction to that whole thing. So it turned out at the time, Chris Poland and Gore were both pretty strung out on heroin, and the other guys were just playing around with it a little bit. They weren't serious druggies yet. Dave's issues with drugs came later. It wasn't a big issue for the sessions that we did. A couple of times, Gore and Chris showed up late or showed up and didn't feel like playing for a while, and then eventually they'd go find some drugs, and then they'd want to play. Other than that, it had no effect on anything. It was my introduction to that. I had been around stuff before.
That's pretty incredible to shoot up and then come out and do a great session.
I think people have this misconception that if you're doing drugs, and especially if you're doing heroin, that you can't perform. People can perform at an extremely high level when they're high, and whether it doesn't really matter which drug it is. I guess if you're really drunk, you can't do anything. But they were performing at a very high level. It wasn't an issue. So I think that's still a misconception is that people have, that if people are high, they're not able to do their job, but they could do their job.
Yeah, you'd almost think maybe timing issues, if anything, more laid back if you're jacked, if you're on coke, maybe too fast,
My experience with drummers is, and this is from playing clubs, I used to play clubs, that drummers don't do well with alcohol or drugs, and it doesn't really matter what it is. But in this particular case with Gar, he didn't have a problem. He played great.
What was it like working with Dave at that time? How was he to work with?
He was fine. He was very professional. He was very serious Megadeth. He was on a mission. He was going to be a rock star. He was going to drive his band to the top. And it's impressive. He did exactly what he said he was going to do. Dave and I, we didn't get along that well. He was a little bit irritated with me because I was so taken with Chris Poland. I was just blown away by Chris Poland's playing and totally enamored with him, and it showed. And Dave took note of that, and it probably would have been a lot smarter to pay more attention to Dave Mustaine and what he was doing and pay less attention to Chris in the long run. But if there was a little tension between me and Dave, that's what it was. But no, other than that, he was fine. He was fine. He's a really professional on all of them. All of them worked really, really hard. They were extremely good to work with in the studio. They worked hard and they were really into it. It was great.
You also mentioned that he had co-produced it. Did he really co-produce the album?
Well, there's a lot of his ideas on there in terms of just getting the sounds and capturing the band. I think that was really more Casey and I in terms of the mechanics of doing the recording and producing the recording. Dave had everything to do with the arrangements and the instrumentation and what went where, and that's producing too. So yeah. I think in terms of the sound, it was more Casey and I think in terms of the arrangements and composition, that element, it was all Dave. He was the guy.
Now, Dave is credited as the only songwriter on that album. Did he allow anybody else to write, or was there any tension within the band during those sessions?
I think none of that happened in the studio that I was aware of. The songs were ready to go. They had just come off the road and they were playing the new stuff, and they played it as a set, and they were totally on. I think there's probably a lot of stuff out there about Dave maybe not being the most generous with musicians in terms of co-writing and credits and stuff. But, I wasn't in the band. I'm not a band member. I wouldn't, I don't know. As far as what went where in the songs and the arrangements and the instruments were, what was going to go where, we need a guitar part here. He was the guy. And my style with them and with other bands has always been very documentary. I assume that the band understands what it is that they want to do and what they want to sound like. I figure my job is to capture that and to make it happen, not go in and fix them and tell them what they need to do.
Of course, yeah.
And that's worked out really well for me. I think it's just the way to go. Let the bands be creative and just help them capture it on tape.
Does Dave lay down all the rhythm guitars, or does Chris do some of that?
They both played rhythm guitars and lead guitars, and they both played on every song. I don't think there was any song where it wasn't both of them playing.
What was your typical way that you recorded guitars back then? I know you said the Rockman going right into the board.
Those were unusual things that we did for solos for Chris, and some of the Rockman, he did different things. I remember that I think there was a twin in studio, which was a really odd thing for the metal bands. They think they had a twin, or we had a twin. I don't know where that came from. And he did something with the Rockman and the twin one. So he also did stuff where he put the Rockman into a Marshall. And then I think we did one where we just went straight into the board, although I wouldn't swear to it. So in general, we would use Marshalls, and we would always rent a couple of heads and a couple of cabinets from someplace. There were only a couple places to rent them from. There was SIR, the Studio Instrument Rentals, which had kind of generic stuff, and then there was, when we discovered Mike Soldano, we started getting everything from him. And we would just line up all the Marshalls, and we would close mic them with 57s and 421s, and we found that different cabinets, try to find the sweet cabinet, try to find the best speaker on the best cabinet, or the best speakers on the best cabinet, and the best head. So we would go through the heads and the cabinets and speakers looking for one that sounded good. And whenever, when we found one, we would stick with that and record with that for a while. The way we put things together, we would record it live with the whole band to get the drum tracks, and we were only looking for the drum tracks, and then at the end of the day, we would probably try to fix the bass or overdub the bass right away, and we'd go through, section by section to get it really tight, and then we would come back and overdub the guitar, the rhythm tracks, and again, we were looking for really super tight double track guitars, so we wanted them really, really meticulous, and when you get them like that, then they jump out of the speakers and sounds really powerful, and that's what's on the Megadeth record. We're both really good at it.
It went pretty quick.
Well, it takes time. It's tedious, and then there were some parts that were a little difficult. Maybe we found a part that didn't work exactly right. We'd make some minor change, or they would make a minor change in the way they were doing something, and then they would both adjust. But no, it takes a while. It's kind of a tedious, slow process. So, we got 10 songs, and the guys are laying down 2 tracks. That's, 40 tracks. So if we got a couple of songs done a day, that was good.
And you'd print the 57 and 421 to tape?
No, we would just print whatever it was, but sometimes it was a combination of mics, sometimes it was just one mic, but almost always it was just those 2 kinds of microphones, 57s and 421s, close mic. We did some other things, particularly for solos. Sometimes we'd stick a condenser mic out there in the room, not too far away, and get a little different sound, but most of the time it was just the 57s and the 421s, and we had a whole bunch of different ways that we would, where we would place the microphone. We'd try, all these different things, and then, one of them would always work, and so we just looked for the best one for that guitar player and for that set of equipment.
When you're saying about different ways you did the solos and putting a condenser on, made me think of Wake Up Dead, that intro. Do you recall what you used there?
No, not specifically. That's just a little different guitar sound. It's just clean sound, so I don't remember specifically how we came about that one.
Anything stand out about that song? Like how you did that background vocal? There's kind of a gang vocal sound towards the end.
Well, yeah, there was a gang vocal thing at the end. We all went out there and did it. I think even Casey was out there, and we had somebody else. We were at Mad Dog recording it, and I think we had one of the guys coming from Mad Dog run the tape machine for us. Casey and I went out and screamed on the end of that. It was a lot of fun. No, we had a good time. We were. It was a real exciting session. Everybody was excited about how it was sounding, and again, there was all this buzz around town and record companies calling and stuff. So it was heady times. Very, very exciting. We knew it was going to go somewhere.
With recording Dave's vocals, did you guys do that at the other studio, in the overdub studio?
We did most of it at Mad Dog. We did a little bit at Grinder early on. Most of it was done at the other studio.
And did you have a process how you recorded his vocals?
No, I don't. Nothing special. We used one of the tube mics, the U47 or the U67, and just a really standard set of stuff for the time. We would run it through an LA2A and just touch it on the way in, and that's it.
You know what kind of pre you used?
It was just a Neve.
Even at the other studio? They had a Neve as well?
At the other studio, I think they had a 3M console, so it would have just been whatever they had.
Okay.
I'm not exactly sure what we were doing over there, but they had a good sound. It was a good sounding studio. It wasn't a neat console. No.
How was it recording his vocals? Was he pretty fast, or did you do line by line?
He struggled a little bit. Singing was kind of it wasn't a new thing for him, but he was still not as confident at the time. It was kind of the weak thing for him. He was a strong guitar player. He was a strong writer, but maybe not that strong as a singer. I think it was a little harder for him to do the vocals than it was to do any of the rest of the stuff. The rest of the stuff, he had down cold. The vocals he struggled with a little bit.
I don't even think he wanted to be the singer. I think they tried to audition several singers, early on. Before.
I think that's right. Yeah. He was sort of reluctantly the guy that got stuck with it. He did fine, but he wasn't as comfortable with that part of it as he was with the other stuff. On the other stuff, he was infinitely confident. He knew exactly what he was doing. On the vocals, he was kind of looking around a little bit, trying to find his space,
What were some of the things that you did to make him comfortable? Did he have anybody else in the studio, or did everybody leave at that time?
I don't remember specifically, but my general way way that I would do that is I would get the other guys to leave. I would try to keep it down to just me and Casey, or just me in the studio, so that he didn't have other people to deal with. And I think almost always with singers, it's best to keep most of the people away from the studio, because they just tend to do better if you don't have an audience right then. Sometimes if you're doing some kind of party thing, then it's fine. It just depends. If it's kind of punk rock and it's all about attitude and not necessarily about vocal performance, then sometimes it's good to have all your friends in the control room and everybody going, yeah, go do the crazy thing, you know. But I'm pretty sure we did most of the vocals with just him.
And what would you say, like maybe take a day per song or a couple of hours, or how long would like a typical song take to get a final vocal?
You know, it just depends on the song, and what we would do is we would do a few hours a night, so we didn't tear up his voice, so he didn't do much. So we'd alternate between doing guitar solos and vocals and rhythm tracks. We would get set up for all three of those things and then do different ones. So when he was singing, he wouldn't have to sing for more than a couple hours at a time. So we like try to get through one whole track in an evening, and then if he went fast, then do another one the same evening. And then on any given night, we would do some rhythm guitars and some solos and some vocals, and then just not do all of them at once. So he ended up singing a few hours a night and no more to save his voice.
And would you typically just have him run through the whole song, or would you guys kind of go line by line?
We like to have him sing the whole song a few times and then go back and fix some spots. Sometimes we do a section at a time. It just depends on the song and how they're doing with it. And, it depends on the particular song and how they do with it. You know, you kind of have to feel it out at the time. His vocals improved dramatically after that record. He got way better. He made up his mind he was going to be good at that point, I think. And somewhere in there he decided, I'm just going to be good at this. That's what's going to happen. And he went out and he really improved dramatically after that record.
And what was Gore like, aside from the drug use and stuff like that, and just working with him? What was he like?
He was great. He was a really fun, nice guy. Gar and Chris, they met in the New York fusion scene, so they were jazzers.
Right.
They are fusion guys, influenced by different kinds of music. And that came out in their composition, both of them for their composition, Chris on his guitar solos and Gar on what he played, the drum parts he played. He played a lot of things that weren't typical metal. I mean, he did interesting, complicated stuff, and he would change the tempo a little bit and change the meter a little bit. And within a single song, they'd have 2 or 3 different parts, and each part would have a different feel and a little different tempo. And he was so smooth with his transitions between that stuff. And I think that's what made that particular record so interesting, was Gar's unique take on the metal drumming thing, and Chris Tolan's, also his composition is not, he doesn't play the generic kind of typical stuff that metal guitar players play.
Right.
His composition is unique and super interesting. And it's influenced by a lot of different kinds of playing, not just metal stuff.
Do you recall what you put on his drums, whether it be like a 57 on the snare or 421s on the toms?
Well, we use the typical drum mic, so 57 on the top of the snare, some small condenser for the bottom of the snare, and then we would use some small condensers. I think they were AKG 451s or something like that. Anyway, these small condenser mics for cymbals. And then, on the toms, it would either be 421s or 57s. Again, it just depended on the drum and what sounded good. And on the kick, we used different things. I think the RE20 was popular at the time, and then there was the D12. There were a couple of dynamic mics with bigger diaphragms, and it was all the same stuff that people used. Nothing really out of the ordinary about it. The drum kit looked like the drum kit. It's typically what engineers would ask for when you set up a drum kit for tracking.
And how long did those drum tracks take? That run about a week, or how long did you spend?
No, it was like it took us maybe 3 days.
Wow. I
think I booked the studio for 4 days, so I think we had good takes on everything before the 4th day. They were just on fire. They played so good and with so much energy and so inspired. I mean, it really was an amazing thing, and the record still sounds great. I listened to it the other night, first time in a while, and it was like, wow, it's really good.
For one, and very unique sounding. Sounds totally different than what anybody was cutting back then.
Yeah, well, that would have been the grinder room, and they had a big, like, warehouse where we put the drums. So we close mic'd the drums, but then it was sitting in this big room, and there's lots of natural reverb on there.
When you're saying that sometimes he wouldn't feel like playing and then he'd do it later, I would think still he did everything in 3 days. So in those 3 days, he still would kind of zone out a little bit?
Well, no, like I said, I remember a couple of days, those guys coming in a little late, or they came in and they didn't feel good, and we weren't getting to recording, and they didn't want to start just yet. And later on, I figured out that they were waiting for some drugs, and once they got their drugs, then they were ready to go. So anyway, the point was that drugs didn't affect the recording hardly at all, except there were a couple of times when things slowed down a little bit, and it seemed kind of mysterious, like, why aren't we recording? And it would be they were busy trying to score some drugs or something. And then once they got that straightened out, then they were the hardest working guys ever, and it was fine. So it really didn't have a big effect on the session from my point of view. It wasn't a big deal. It was a learning experience for me. It was like, oh, okay, yeah, so this is what heroin's about, a little bit of exposure to that.
You're supposed to wait and get on heroin after you've made it.
Well, for Chris, Chris got kicked out of the band shortly thereafter.
Right.
And then he got clean. Chris and I did, we were talking about the Return to Metalopolis album in 1990, or 90 or 91, I guess. I think it was right there at the end of 90.
And he's clean by then, right?
Oh, yeah, he'd been clean for a long time. And I had an issue with alcohol and amphetamines, but I was still functioning pretty good. But those things cloud your judgment a little bit and cause you to be, personality-wise, not as professional as you would like. So anyway, I eventually got to clean too, and I quit drinking in 1989. So all of us had issues with drugs and alcohol.
So you're even jacked during those recordings?
Well, we drank a lot, and we did some amphetamines, yeah.
Right. Appropriate genre to be recording.
Everybody did it. They were either doing cocaine or a little bit of amphetamines, and then you could stay up late, and then you could drink a little beer and do the amphetamines to kind of stay on top of things.
Well, you could drink a ton of beer.
You've done this.
I'm an old pro. I mean,
So anyway, I'm just saying, they weren't the only ones to have, issues with drug and alcohol. There was a lot of that.
The holy grail of the songs, Peace Sells, the title track. Anything come to mind about recording that song?
I think maybe we spent a little more time on the vocal on that one, trying to come up with some different things, because he knew if there was a single, that was it. That was the simple rocker, and it had the little bass hook at the beginning, and so we spent more time on the vocals on that one, trying to make it a little more accessible than the other stuff. Like some of the stuff, definitely more album cuts. You know what I mean? That one was kind of like they thought, we'll get on MTV, we'll get on the radio.
They were right.
Yeah, that was the opening riff that MTV stole and used for their signature.
Of course.
Yeah. For what, a decade?
Right. Did you just go direct with his bass, or were you miking up an amp, or both?
Well, he had an amp, and we did both. He had a great sounding amp. He had a great sound. Ellison is an amazing bass player and had an amazing sound. His amp sounded great. We recorded it, and we also had a DI, and we mixed them in when we did the mix.
Any kind of memory spark on Good Morning, that intro, and Black Friday?
I remember that it was, the songs were so good. It was like every time they would come on, I would be caught up in them. They really pulled you in, and they were interesting compositions, complicated, and with lots of different parts and different textures, and slow and clean, and it was dark. I just remember being so impressed by it. Every time we would do the playback, it would be like, God, this is good. It was just an amazing session. It's usually not like that. Usually the record has moments of like, wow, that's that chorus right there. It's great. Or this hook right here, everybody's nodding their head going, yeah, that section just totally rocks, and it's great. With Megadeth, it's like every single part was great. Every single riff was great. Every song was great. It was just a unique moment.
And so you originally mixed that record?
Yeah, we did.
But that never got released, correct?
I think Dave later on released some of that stuff
in a box set
a few years later. I right now am starting to work again. I got married, had kids, and when I had a kid, I took him out of LA and went away from the music scene and didn't even look at that for 20-something years. But for the last 5 or 6 years, I've been trying to figure out how to get back in, how to get going again. What I did was I built a mix room in my garage in my new house, and I'm just getting rolling on it, and I'm doing some mixing. Just starting to do some work with Tom Hazard over at Combat again. It's like me and Combat Records. Tom signed Chris Poland. He's also working with Dave Ellison, and anyway, I'm working with him. He's helping me get some work, doing some mixing for some different bands and on some different labels. Yeah, someday I'd like to get a shot at remixing some of that stuff. I need to get some stuff out there, and then I'll go approach Dave. I would love to get another shot at mixing that record. That's what I'm doing now. I'm going to be doing mixing now. I don't need a big studio to do that. I just need a room that sounds good. Right. And I've got that now.
And you're all in the box.
Yeah, and now I'm doing everything in the box, learning how to drive the box instead of the Neve console. So we'll see what happens in the future.
What are 3 of your most fond memories from those Peace Cells recording sessions?
I would say the whole basic track sessions, that 4 days of tracking was just absolute magic. Those guys went out there and laid that stuff down, and they played so good and with so much intensity. It was just, I've never seen anything like it. I made a bunch of great records with a bunch of great bands, but those guys were a cut above. And it came together. We didn't know. I knew the band was good, but I didn't know it was going to materialize like that. And let's see, what else? Doing the backup vocals for Black Friday and some of the Wake Up Dead stuff where we did the crowd, and I went out and screamed with those guys. That was really, really fun. We all had a great time. It was a lot of camaraderie, and because we had we were getting down to the very end, and we knew we had the record, so everybody felt good. And being in the room when Chris Poland played the solos, oh my God, he was just phenomenal. And so those would be 3 elements.
And his solos, like when you're recording them, is he mapping them out ahead of time, or is he kind of just winging stuff?
I think there were a couple little riffs that he had that, something he had played that maybe Dave had asked him to repeat. But most of the time he went at him clean, and we just wait for him to do something that he felt really good about and that I felt really good about. And I did push them pretty hard on the solo stuff to get really good performances, and we got them.
Well, they're badass. And when you guys record, when you say you're recording at night, like what time are you coming in and what time do you leave?
Well, when we were doing the tracking days, we had the studio locked out. We used to come in at 10 or 11 in the morning and then stay till maybe midnight or something like that, or maybe 10. It just depended on what we got done. On the other studio, when we were doing nights at Mad Dog, again, when we did the Mad Dog part, they had the country guys in the day, and then we came in and did the nights. We'd start at 6 and probably go to 2 or 3.
I hate to leave any story on the table. Have we milked this thing for all it's worth?
I think so. I think I've been there enough. It really was an amazing event. It was the perfect example of catching lightning in a bottle. It was the right place and the right time, and we did the right thing. We got the magic on tape, and it still holds up really well.
Often I do these inside the album interviews, and the person I'm interviewing doesn't even realize they're making history at the time of the recording. But in that moment, you knew you were making history.
We knew it on that one, and I would be interested. I think Dave knew it. I think the whole band knew it. Certainly Casey knew it, the guy I was working with. We knew this was the big one.